folks, Dr. Robert Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. Now, I've been wanting to do this video for some time. It's something that it's a topic that I've been quite actively researching, and it's really about how a lot of the drugs that are used to treat depression and anxiety that are used by allopathic mainstream medicine, they may not exactly work the way that we're told that they work. There are a number of different classes of antidepressant drugs, and they all have different modes of action that are explained in our textbooks and in our medical journals as well. We have, for example, classes of drug that inhibit certain enzymes, and this allows neurotransmitter levels to increase. There are certain drugs that inhibit transporters, and this again has an effect at increasing levels of neurotransmitters in the brain in particular areas. And this is how we're told that many of the particularly the antidepressants, and in some case the anti-anxiety drugs, we're told how their mode of action is within the brain. And there is evidence that they do have these effects. I'm not denying that these effects have been observed, but I'm questioning whether this is actually the way that these drugs are beneficial to mental health. Now, what I want to do is and the reason I'm doing this video is because there is an interesting and very it's quite widely reported, but it's not reported in the mainstream. There's quite a widely reported effect for these drugs in scientific literature that shows that they actually act as antioxidants in the brain. I will put a paper that has evidence of this. It's kind of a review paper that shows the antioxidant capacity of a list of these antidepressant drugs, and many of them, including in human trials, have been shown to actually have antioxidant effects in the brain. Now, this is very interesting because this is the reason why I believe that many plant compounds, and not just herbs but foods as well, that are rich in antioxidants have the ability to elevate mood. When you start to research the number of not just herbs but also fruits and vegetables that have actually been, many of them are common foods, many of them have been researched and shown to have antidepressant and anti-anxiety effects. And one of the common things that you find with these foods is that they all contain high amounts of antioxidants. Now, this is very interesting because I think it illustrates nicely how these drugs are sometimes misunderstood, and they're sometimes overused, and sometimes really the mechanism of action of these drugs is overstated. I don't think there's any doubt that they are having an effect on neurotransmitter levels in the brain. For example, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, there is evidence that they do prevent the reuptake of serotonin, and therefore they increase the amount of serotonin in particular parts of the brain. This increases the neurotransmission of serotonin, and this has neurochemical effects. But the point is that many of these SSRIs have also been evidenced to have antioxidant effects, and what we can say about the antidepressant drugs is that their mechanism of action is very similar to many of the antioxidants we find in fruits and vegetables, particularly the polyphenols, and in a particular group of polyphenols called the flavonoids. Now, the flavonoids appear to have a dual role in the brain. Certainly there is a lot of evidence that, like many of these mainstream pharmaceutical drugs, there is evidence that flavonoids and other polyphenols bind directly to proteins and enzymes in the brain, and these have direct neurochemical effects. So, for example, I can't go into all of the effects that they have, but I will give some examples. Quercetin, for example, is a flavonoid, which is a subgroup of the polyphenols, and quercetin is known to bind to the GABA receptor. Now, the GABA receptor is a receptor in the brain that, when activated, will decrease excitatory neurotransmission in the brain. In other words, it has a calming effect. When you take supplemental GABA or you take supplemental L-theanine, those two compounds have this effect because they activate the GABA receptor. Quercetin is another compound that is able to activate this receptor. Now, that means that quercetin likely has, or potentially has, some anti-anxiety effects through its activation of through the GABA receptor. However, there is a large amount of evidence that shows that quercetin also acts as an antioxidant, and uh, along with other flavonoids and other polyphenols, it appears to have neuroprotective effects. And one of the things it does is it decreases the oxidative stress in the brain. Now, why is this particularly protective of mood disorders, and why does this improve mental health? Well, you have to look at the damage that is done from the stress that we're exposed to in daily life. We're exposed to stress all the time, and that stress is really a perceived stress. The same stress, we call them stressors, the same stressor might not affect the same person, might not affect different people in the same way. So it's a perceived stress. But once you have that perceived stress, and we're all exposed to different types of stresses, some people are particularly susceptible to relationship stress, some people are particularly susceptible to physical stress. There's all different types of stress. They all affect different people in different ways. But when you have that perceived stress, we release, as humans and animals as well, they release a slightly different chemical, but we release cortisol. Animals release corticosterone, and these chemicals are our stress hormones. Now, cortisol in humans is particularly damaging if it's released in a chronic way at very high levels. At low levels, cortisol has a beneficial effect. Its purpose is to prepare the body for the stress. It has certain anti-inflammatory effects. It can actually be protective. But the problem is when people are exposed to high levels of stress for long periods of time, the cortisol levels become too high, and then the cortisol has damaging effects. Now, one of the effects that cortisol can have is it can actually bind directly to the GABA receptor, and at high levels cortisol will block the GABA receptor, which decreases this inhibitory effect in the brain and actually causes an excitatory effect, and that might be a contributory factor in anxiety. Cortisol has other effects in the brain as well, though. It actually causes neurodegeneration, and it actually causes atrophy of particular parts of the brain. And one of the mechanisms by which that might happen is through the generation of free radicals. If we have a look, for example, at people with post-traumatic stress disorder, if we have a look at people who have had, been abused as children, they have this atrophy in particular parts of the brain, and this has been explained as the effects of long-term high levels of cortisol causing damage to neurons in the brain. And the mechanism by which that damage might occur may be through the generation of free radicals and oxidative stress. And this is why antioxidants are so protective of mood disorders. If you can limit that potentially damaging oxidative stress in the brain, you can limit inflammation, you can limit the atrophy and the damage to particular tissues, and therefore you can have this neuroprotective effect. And this is very much what appears to be happening with some of these polyphenols, particularly the flavonoids. They appear to have this dual role where not only are in the short term are they able to activate the GABA receptor, and therefore they may have an anti-anxiety effect. Over a slightly longer period of time, they may actually have beneficial effects at protecting neurons. And obviously if you protect neurons, you then start to allow neuroregeneration, you start to allow the brain to recover. You're protecting it from the damaging effects of cortisol, and this may have beneficial effects on mood. There are other lines of evidence to explain to evidence that this is perhaps what is happening. There's a compound called phosphatidylserine, and when you take that, it appears to be able to lower cortisol levels. And one of the other effects of taking phosphatidylserine is that it does appear to have cognitive and mood enhancing benefits. And so there is a reasonable amount of evidence that lowering cortisol levels and reducing stress is beneficial to your mental health. And if you lower the cortisol directly, that will clearly have a beneficial effect on your brain. But if you also lower the damaging effect of the oxidative stress in the brain, that can also have a beneficial effect. So if you think of polyphenols as actually having two real effects, in the short term they can activate the GABA receptor, and they interact with other receptors as well. But there is also this other antioxidant role that they play, and it appears that actually many of the pharmaceutical drugs may be having this dual role. But I really wanted to make this video because many people look in a very blinkered way at the pharmaceutical drugs. They suspect that selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors are working on the serotonin system, and that is true. But what happens is people become focused on serotonin as the only way to improve depression, and that's, I think, a big problem with these drugs. They work in single ways, and if that mechanism of action is not the way it's described, what you're effectively doing is you're providing disinformation. I think that yes, serotonin is involved in depression. It may be involved in anxiety as well, and certainly the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors do affect the serotonin system. However, clinically, they're not as effective as we're told they are. If you actually look at the research that's done on the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors and the other newer classes of drugs like the noradrenaline reuptake inhibitors and even the dopamine reuptake inhibitors, they're not as effective as we're told they are. They do appear to have some effects, and those effects might actually be explained by other mechanisms. It might be that they do raise levels of dopamine in particular parts of the brain. They may also raise levels of noradrenaline or serotonin. But if they're actually working as antioxidants, that might be the way that explains how they're working. Now, if that is true, and that the antioxidant mechanism is the way that they are actually protective of your mental health, there is really no point taking them, because you can get that antioxidant effect from eating particular foods and taking particular supplements. And this may explain that why, when you take really quite common foods, in some cases things like garlic, you take foods, common herbs that are, even spices that are commonly put into food, and you test them for their antidepressant and anti-anxiety effects, you find that they're equally as effective as the best drugs that the pharmaceutical industry can offer. That many of these compounds have been compared to the latest selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or the other, going back, they were tested against things like imipramine, which is a tricyclic antidepressant. They always fare very well and are usually as effective in animal models as these pharmaceutical drugs. And if it is the antioxidant effect that's actually having an effect in the brain, if it's the antioxidant effect that's actually causing the antidepressant or anxiolytic effect, that would explain why these foods are so useful. And one thing that's worth bearing in mind, that these compounds, these foods, these herbs, spices that have been tested against these drugs, whenever they're tested, they don't really show any side effects. And as you would expect from foods, there are no real side effects from consuming commonly eaten herbs, spices, and foods, because they're part of our diet. They're not drugs. They work in a different way. However, when you look at the negative side effects of a lot of the pharmaceutical drugs, what you tend to find is that in certain, I'm not saying this happens to all people, some people do respond well to them, but in certain people they do seem to have some very negative effects. And increasingly, and I've been discussing this with other nutritionists, increasingly there are so many people that want to get off these drugs. They find that they don't really feel themselves when they're on them, and what actually happens is these drugs are changing the individual's personality. They're almost zombifying these people, and they start to realize that after a while, and really what they think of as an antidepressant or anti-anxiety effect is not. It's really just a numbing effect that seems to take you out of reality. So they do have these neurochemical, they could call these neurochemical changes, and it might actually be that these changes in the neurotransmitters are what causing the negative effects. Perhaps the positive effects in these drugs, when they do work with people, are actually coming from the antioxidant effects they have. And like I say, I'll put this paper up in the comments box below this video, so you can actually have a look, and I think you'll be quite surprised at how many of these drugs have been shown in clinical research, in cell culture studies, in animal studies, and in human studies to have this antioxidant effect. So what's the take-home message from this video? Well, if you go through my other videos and you look at all of the the herbs, the spices, the foods that I've talked about that have these beneficial mood enhancing effects, you see that they're all rich in antioxidants. You see that they all have these common, they have a high polyphenolic and high flavonoid contents. And if you eat foods like that, and if you put these into your diet, you really protect yourself from developing mood disorders. And I've made the comment before that one of my personal opinions is that the Western diet is really the main cause of many of the mood disorders that we see around us. Sure, it's to do with our environment as well, but those people that eat a high quality diet, they can still get mood disorders. I'm not denying that, but they're greatly protected from them, and the evidence is clear on that. If you eat a high quality diet, if you throw these foods into your diet so that you're consuming high levels of antioxidants, you do significantly reduce your risk of developing mood disorders. And if you already have a mood disorder, my advice to you is not to look for the magic bullet, trying to mimic what these drugs do, trying to mimic the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors by taking L-tryptophan and other single amino acids. They can be helpful, but I think they need to be seen as a part of a holistic approach. I think that really what you really should be doing is trying to improve your general health and your brain health, and trying to lower your cortisol levels and your exposure to stress. If you can lower the damaging effects of any elevated levels of cortisol and lower your stress levels, generally I think your neurochemistry will help sort itself out. And one part of that is to be able to give yourself a very high quality diet that allows you to be able to cope more, to allow yourself to cope over the long term with stress, and allows your body to be able to deal with stress so that you're less affected by the detrimental effects. So that's something to think about. If you maybe taken these drugs in the past, or you know people that take them, there is evidence that they work as antioxidants, and we know that polyphenols, flavonoids, and a lot of these foods that are protective of mental health are also very good antioxidants. And therefore what I would suggest is, if you are interested in not just protecting your physical health but your mental health, you try and put as many of these antioxidants in your diet as possible, and the best way to do that is to consume lots of fruits and vegetables, herbs and spices, and really try and put as many plant foods in your diet as you can. So I hope that was interesting. As always, eat well, stay healthy, and protect yourself, and I will see you soon for another video. Take care.